And so, welcome everyone to this month's New York Space Business Roundtable. Our topic today is satellites boosting sustainable technologies. We are very happy that you are here. We have a robust program today. I want to do a quick little bit of housekeeping. First of all, you are all on mute, and the only people who will be able to mute and unmute are our guests, our panelists for the day, and of course, our hosts. But the chat is open. You are welcome to put comments, suggestions, questions, anything that you'd like in the chat box. Of course, we encourage any questions and answers to go there. And what else do I need to tell you? We will be starting in just one. Well, actually, we're at 12, so we will be starting. And with that, I'm going to mute myself, and we're going to kick it off with one of the videos from our ongoing Better Satellite World campaign, which we hope that you check out at bettersatelliteworld.com. And with that, Matt, take it away.
Water. We're made of this stuff. We also drink it, bathe in it, cook with it, grow food with it, clean with it, and use it in almost every kind of industry. Today, parts of the world are also running out of it as our planet warms up and new weather patterns emerge. That leads to political turmoil, to migration and talk of water wars. Making sure that people have enough water has become a global challenge, and there is a global technology ready to help. Satellite. It's the invisible technology that is indispensable to the way we live. Have you ever wondered how much water there is on Earth? Nobody knew until a satellite mission called GRACE found the answer. The GRACE satellites measure changes in gravity as they pass over the Earth, which lets them tell the difference between water, rock, and soil, and also measure how deep the water is. A few calculations later, and we found out for the first time how much of this precious substance we have. Most of the water we use comes from below ground, and satellites are helping us peer below the surface. California scientists have used a NASA radar satellite to guide the search for new groundwater. Another team uses satellite measurements of ground temperature to learn how deeply the water is buried. That matters, especially in developing nations, where many wells are dug by hand. Finding water near the surface can be the difference between life and death. That water underground is like money in the bank. You can drain more from it than nature can restore, just like writing a check for more than you have in your account. It takes a satellite to show the result. The ground actually sinking as the water is drawn out. As ground level sinks, it can permanently reduce how much water can be stored. Parts of California sank 13 feet during the 20th century, until smart new policies gave underground reserves time to recharge. Water can also be too much of a good thing. Flooding kills more people than any other natural disaster, but nations around the world now use satellite radar data to forecast flooding before it happens and make accurate maps to guide their response to disaster. The United Nations expects nearly 2 billion people to face water scarcity by 2025, and the occasional shortage to affect another 3 billion. As water becomes ever more precious, we will depend even more on satellites to keep it flowing.
Brought to you by the Society of Satellite Professionals International and Boeing.
And we thank them for that. Hello, everyone. It's the third Wednesday of the month and the first New York Space Business Roundtable of 2022. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lou Zaccarella, the Director of Innovation here at SSPI. Well, we welcome you and our SSPI members and chapters in New York, North America, and worldwide. We've really been pleased at the audiences we've been developing, and we're glad you're back this year. Welcome also on behalf of our partner in this endeavor to answer key investment and social questions related to space and satellites and all of our lives, the New York Space Alliance. Well, we ended last year discussing ethics, as you recall, and we're going to start 2022 by working some of those ideas into investment and business modeling around an issue that affects every one of us, climate. The former UCLA basketball coach, when I was a little guy, Coach John Wooden, once said, "It's what you learn after you know it all that counts." Well, my New Year's resolution is to let that quote be my guide in 2022 and here at the roundtable. So before we go to the roundtable, I'd like to thank supporters of this series from 2021, Luxembourg Trade and Investment Office here in New York, our media partner, Space News Magazine, and there's a new issue out this month talking about SPACs. The roundtable is also supported by World Teleport Association, the Washington Space Business Roundtable, and New Space New York, and we appreciate their support. Well, I heard a remark on CNBC last week that kind of stopped me. The report said, as a new wave of climate-focused investing gets underway, climate tech companies were on track to reach a record of 50+ billion in equity funding in 2021. In the same way that every company today is a tech company, the need for persistent global monitoring and coordination of climate and related factors such as food, water, and the biosphere will see every company of tomorrow become a space company. Joe Fargnoli, I don't know if I agree with that, but I did like the way it sounded, being with Space and Satellite Professionals International. And I thought, hey, this is a nice phrase to tee up this year's discussion. Joe is the president of the New York Space Alliance. Joe, I don't know if I agreed, but I liked it.
I think it's a really interesting comment, Lou. And I think what it really points out to is the interconnectedness of many matters that we deal with. And today, in looking at climate, one of the key things that we're going to look at is, yes, climate is interconnected with everything. Climate is interconnected with space. How do we form the collective will among the business community, the scientific community, the financial community, to come together and leverage space to the extent that we can to address this global challenge? So to explore this today, we're going to have, as usual, a very frank and open conversation about this. And we've assembled a team of industry experts to come together and evaluate this topic and to look at what are the underlying factors that we as a society need to align in order to bring our full capabilities to bear on this significant problem. So I want to introduce our speakers today who are going to really help explore some detailed elements around this question. I first want to introduce Mr. Paul Gloyer. Paul is an experienced executive and accomplished program manager. He has 25 years of experience delivering technical solutions to the aerospace industry's most challenging problems. He has led efforts to develop a wide variety of aerospace systems, including the PAX suborbital rocket and the PAE-15K rocket engine, the Sport Orbit Transfer Vehicle, and the Encounter solar sail craft. His experience has paved the way for a wide spectrum of projects at his company, which is GTL, ranging from small integrated technical systems to large complex space missions. So he should be very well-equipped and well-experienced to join this conversation with us. On the phenomenology side, I want to introduce Douglas Helmuth. Doug had a very successful career with Lockheed Martin as a principal investigator, working across virtually all of their programs. So when it comes to the science of building climate measuring satellites, Doug is really an industry expert. Doug had an interest in climate technology at Lockheed Martin, but since he retired in 2017, or he's now self-employed, so to speak, he's committed to building and improving our understanding of climate science. And he's developed a 40-minute presentation teaching the fundamentals of climate change. So if any of your organizations would like that kind of an overview, please get in touch with Doug. He's really dedicated his career at this point to addressing the climate challenge. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Sanjay Huegel. Sanjay is co-founder and managing director of the Lightsmith Group. He has over 20 years of experience in investing, company management, and government focused on clean energy, resources, and climate. His investing experience includes 8 years in venture capital and growth equity. He was the first principal of the clean tech group at Vantage Point Capital Partners, which invested over $1 billion in 25 companies in electric vehicles, most notably Tesla Motors, solar, storage, smart grid, green building, water, and sustainable agriculture. Earlier in his career, Sanjay served as an investment officer at the International Finance Corporation, where he led financing of private sector transport, power, and water infrastructure projects in developing countries. So to have a very robust conversation today, I think we've got three great experts. We look at Doug in the fundamental climate science side, Paul in the real practical applications of building and fielding space systems, and Sanjay in the finance side. So to kind of kick things off a little bit, I really want to ask a dual question, right? Fundamentally, I want to ask Doug and Paul a question about how commercially adaptable, how ready is commercial industry to technically address the climate challenge? Measuring climate-related data is not as simple as just taking a picture of the Earth. Okay, it takes precise radiometric measurements. It takes different phenomenologies, and it's an exacting science. We need to understand this data right. One of our biggest challenges today is that we don't agree on the science. So I'm going to ask Doug, how ready do we think commercial industry is to step into the scientific and the technical challenge of delivering the right kind of data that our systems need? I'm also going to ask Sanjay about how ready are we as a private industry government type cooperation to build the right kind of public-private partnerships that are needed for us to develop the collective will to form the kind of programs that have to be formed jointly between private capital and government to be able to fund the kind of money that's needed to really meaningfully address this problem. And the example that I like to use is, some of the very good things that NASA has done in bringing forward early money to stimulate the commercial industry to go after certain challenges, such as the funding that was brought forward when SpaceX was first getting into business and started doing commercial resupply to the space station. NASA put up some money, private industry came forward, lo and behold, a fairly good success story. So let me first start with maybe Doug and Paul about, are we ready commercially to tackle this level of problem from a technology standpoint? And then over to Sanjay for, do we think we can build the collective will in a public-private partnership to really take on this problem? So Doug, maybe you want to kick us off with your thoughts. And you're on mute right now, Doug.
Oh, sorry. I thought oops.
You're good. You're good.
Okay. Overshot. Yeah. As far as the data available to support many uses, I'd say it's prolific and it's ever increasing. In fact, you mentioned that having become self-employed 2 years ago, working for myself, one of my key objective is to, with any organization, try and see that they have a generalized perspective on the nature of climate change. And that comes from fundamental data sets. I mean, if you think in terms of 3 people and the data that they've been responsible for us to now have, Chris Rapley for ice cores, which is this incredible history we have down in Antarctica of what the climate was like in hundreds of thousands of years ago. You have David Keeling and the instrument that he built when he came out to Scripps, and he was a young PhD, and it's been on the top of Mauna Loa for 50 years, and it has given us a curve, an ever increasing sinusoidal wave of what the concentration of CO2 is in the atmosphere. And then ironically, the third person, if you used James Balog, who was a National Geographic's photographer, who suddenly became interested in ice and is responsible for the video that many have seen called Chasing Ice. but his team captured one of the largest calving events of ice in Greenland. And that video is so dramatic, it's very hard for anyone to not come away thinking, oh my gosh, this is a huge change. So I'm always eager that people are starting from a similar point, understanding what data exists. And as far as how it's advancing, I had an extraordinary experience back in 2016, being at a GCOS conference in Amsterdam. And this was, for me, it was very fortunate because just like a line from Hamilton, you know, being in the room with the climate scientists, what they were thinking, and they were all apologizing for the fact that they'd let people think of just temperature, surface temperature, as being a good metric, when in fact it's a very poor one. So they all were entreating each other to come out of their white towers and explain more of the complexity of climate change, and making that aware, very readily aware to the public. So again, I believe what they show, what was shown at that conference, their GCOS is responsible to the World Meteorological Organization for putting together a database of what is called the essential climate variables. It's over 260 well-defined measurements that should be made. Half of them can be made from space. The rest are often ground-based. But they lay out in detail the efforts they go through to improve that list, to now add to it the risk and the impact for those issues, and to refine a smaller list, maybe 12 items that should be measured and should be made available to the public, you know, so they can see how we're doing.
Right.
Because if we do tackle the problem, you know, we need to be able to show what is changing.
Right. So Doug, if I can just interrupt you for a second, Joe, what we've just heard is probably the most extensive explanation of the fact of the problem, but also, as Doug, you know, keeps insisting rightly, the complexity of it. And so you're, I think, trying to get at here whether the complexity of this problem is of such a scale that the tools that we have now in commerce, in business, even in government, may not be fully adequate in the present to deal with this. Is that kind of where we wanted to throw this to Sanjay and Paul now? I think you're on mute, Joe.
Yeah, I think the question was, do we think that commercial data can be impactful? And what I heard from Doug is that, yeah, in fact, it can. There may still be some gaps, but it sounds like the commercial model is viable to have an impact to providing the data that we need to manage the climate challenge. And if we swing that over to Sanjay at this point, let's go on that assumption that Doug feels that, yeah, there's impact that commercial can have. It's not just that only the GO satellite and other government satellites can be effective here. Let's talk now about the opportunity that we have. You know, this is like one of these situations we're always waiting for someone else to be the agent of change. Well, if we as a space community has said we're going to be the agent of change, we think we can be impactful. Now it's a question of, can we align the financing? Can we align the will, the collective will to come together on this problem? So to Sanjay, relative to the idea of having public-private partnerships, what kind of public participation would private capital want to see to be able to come in and really be impactful on this problem? What is your view on that?
I'd like to, I'll talk about that, but I'd like to go back to your first question of, will every company be a space company? And what I would say is, I don't know about every company being a space company directly, but every sector can use space-based data and the analytics that come from that. And thanks to the explosion of low Earth orbit satellites, we've got just a lot more sensors and a lot more data coming at us. all kinds of data, mapping, imaging, weather data, and other data, new kinds of sensors going up. And then the forecasting and analytics you can do based on that are really powerful and can help every sector: agriculture, aviation, shipping, infrastructure, finance, insurance and bank lending, electric and water utilities, all can be better managed using this kind of data. Now that we are going to have global coverage, higher resolution, faster revisit rates, you can do a lot with that data. And I'll just give you an example. You can better manage global supply chains. We've seen how COVID has disrupted, thrown global supply chains haywire by having more data and location data on these supply chains. You can better manage them. Now, all of this is becoming increasingly important because of the disruptions from climate change. Whether it's wildfires out here in California, or heat waves, droughts, floods. I gave the example when we talked yesterday of the Rhine River suffering drought, lost 50% of its volume, and it disrupted shipping, and that affected the steel and energy industries in Europe. So satellites can provide more and better data, and private companies are serving that data to every industry. And so I think we're seeing a renaissance of space, and we're seeing both a boom in space tech and in climate tech. And there's actually this convergence. And it's interesting, you mentioned Luxembourg as a sponsor. They're a backer of our fund, and they also are hoping to be leaders in both space tech and climate tech, which I think was part of their interest in our fund.
Hey, Sanjay, can I just, because you said something very interesting there. You talked about the degree to which this has sort of worked its way into not only vertical industries, but processes and functions. How should the investment community, or how is the investment community looking at that? Because that is going to reveal, as COVID has done, some things that we didn't quite expect. I mean, these are the types of things that collapse civilizations. So they're kind of big deals, I would imagine, from the investment point of view as well. How do you look at that?
The way we look at it, and including in this convergence with space tech, and we are seeing an increasing number of the climate tech companies we work with, either purchasing satellite-based data or even launching satellites themselves.
Right.
But the way we look at it is space-based data, weather data, mapping, imaging, to understand the effects of climate change, because these disruptions are affecting every industry right now, and they're increasingly trying to grapple with that, plan for it, and respond better when these disruptions happen. And so they're looking for good, actionable, localized, asset-specific information so they can manage their businesses, like an electric utility managing wildfire risk. Where are the trees getting too close to power lines? Where are the temperatures and the winds driving increased wildfire risk? So, my electric utility here in Northern California went bankrupt because of these wildfires, and just came back from bankruptcy. And all electric utilities are trying to manage wildfire and storm risks better. And so satellite-derived weather data and imaging and mapping data is being increasingly used to better manage that. So just one industry, one example. And so our view as investors is technology companies that provide these data and analytics are going to be increasingly in demand. They're going to have great business-led growth opportunities that really have nothing to do with government. We can talk about the government and public policy piece separately. But these are just great business growth opportunities. And the companies offering these technologies and data are really differentiated. They have opportunities that their peers do not. They have differentiated data, differentiated analytics that are increasingly being needed by these industries, by these companies. And we want to invest in helping them grow.
Very good. Joe, do you have a question for Paul as well? Because I have one.
Go ahead, Lou.
Yeah, just picking up on Sanjay's discussion, Paul, and comments about opportunities and how space and the climate are sort of core to the thinking of what may emerge as new business opportunities. You design and build very complex systems for the aerospace and space sectors. Has the impact of the climate debate influenced your business modeling to the degree where you look at investments and opportunities now as core to what you do, or is it just kind of there? How are you looking at it as an entrepreneur?
Thanks, Lou. We're a small business, but we've actually found that the climate debate has had a huge effect on what we're doing. It was surprising. We've been almost exclusively focused on space and launch systems, trying to, bring down the cost of access to space and field new systems, to gather the data and all that. But it actually turns out that one of our technologies that we developed for these launch systems has a dramatic opportunity to cut global emissions. And we've been, the breakthrough performance that we got is game changing for the hydrogen economy it's our composite cryotank technology. Dramatically cuts the weight of the tanks and lets us carry 10 times more hydrogen than you can with conventional technology. But what that means is that a hydrogen powered aircraft can fly 4 times as far as with standard aviation fuel. And so that allows us to eliminate all those emissions from, the carbon coming out of it with just clean water in the exhaust. But what's really exciting is this is not just an environmental push of saying, oh, let's do hydrogen, let's do alternative propulsion. We actually have found that we can actually cut the cost of flying aircraft by 50% using this technology that we developed for space. And with the cost reduction that much, it becomes an economic pull to try to make that happen. And it's now aligned with the environmental push. So we're going the same direction, economics and environmental concerns that will, greatly accelerate the adoption. So we're poised to make this huge change to the global economy and, potentially cut carbon emissions by half in the next few decades.
Wow.
Which could really let us make progress on that. So the challenge for us, going to what Sanjay said, is getting to the investment. We're a small business, we've got the tech. How do we go about getting that investment to make this happen?
Paul, I mean, that's very exciting. Of course, we knew about it, but for people to hear that, it's got to be a thrill. What is, aside from the investment, or I guess in addition to the investment, what's the biggest hurdle so far? Because, Sanjay said we're going to talk about government and policy sort of separately, but I would think, well, go ahead. What are the challenges?
One of the big hurdles is just getting people to know about it. We're a small company. We have very limited ability to touch the world and let people know. Debates like this are a big way that we can reach out. But we've got the technology, we've got the data that shows it works, and we're now just trying to implement it and get in there and change the world in a big way using space and launch technology. At the same time, as we do this for aviation, it will help us further develop the space aspects, which will allow us to cut the cost to launch, down from thousands of dollars a kilograms now to down to $100 to $300 a kilogram. To put that in context, at those price points of $100 a kilogram, that's a person flying to space. The ticket price would be comparable to a first-class ticket to China and back from the US.
Wow.
That's the type of price point we're looking at able to achieve. And when we have that low cost, you can now send up these satellite platforms that can get more and more data and higher quality. There's a big push lately to do microsats, lots and lots of satellites, but they're fundamentally limited with aperture size. They just can't, they're so small, they can't have big telescopes. But and they're flying the small ones because it's so expensive still. But if we get the cost down, we can now fly larger spacecraft and still make them, cheap and affordable, and get that data for less cost and better data. So this is back and forth going on. So development, investments in space technology, turn around and help, the hydrogen economy, aviation, which then turns around and helps the space economy. and back and forth and just feeds on itself. And we could be seeing a new technical revolution about to happen.
Yeah. Sanjay, did he get your attention at all when he was speaking?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thought he might. Joe, back over to you.
Well, I guess I still want to get back to this idea of there being a tipping point in financing. You know, there were a lot of what's going on in space right now is really absolutely not new. But I'll say that we've been pushing commercial for a lot of years, and I think some of the early tailwinds that Elon got from NASA to incentivize the space station resupply program really helped push SpaceX along. And as SpaceX went, I'll say that we all started to believe that commercial space was viable and more things could be done in space. So I can't say enough about the positive effect that I think NASA had there to pushing this whole community forward. And I want to ask that same, I'm going to dwell on that same question again. I'm not going to pick on NASA, but how, my personal feeling is this problem is bigger than any one company's business case. It is difficult to monetize a space system focused on climate. Is the payoff there? It absolutely is there, but it's a lot harder to find. It's different than going out and saying, I'm going to measure cars in parking lots and report that back and do business analytics. This is a little more remote. It's the time frame is a little bit longer. So my concern about the viability of the commercial space industry to address the climate problem is that the feedback loop on return on investment is longer. And it's not as direct. So it seems to take more of a collective will to come together and have role for government, have role for private. And my question is really all about how do we get to that critical mass of collective recognition and willingness to address this problem to be able to impact it in a meaningful way. What I don't want to see happen is a lot of small, commercial space companies focused on climate go out there and raise some money and try to do some good things, but never really be effective enough to be able to be a successful long-term business. So, I could be wrong in the assumption that we need to have this collective, investment attitude towards this, but that's really where, I'm trying to drive the question to, and I'm kind of looking to Sanjay maybe to lead us further in that conversation.
Well, let me take a little bit of
I was just going to say, Doug, Doug, this is not something where your old employer, Lockheed Martin, could go it alone, is it? By Joe's definition.
Absolutely not. And the scale that's required is global. Climate change is global. In fact, I did mention going to this conference back in 2016. And the only reason that we as an aerospace, or I in particular, was in the room was having worked a few conferences before with European organizations to be vetting the idea that because of the expense of climate requirements in satellites, it really requires for long term, it requires a constellation. And we were pushing the idea of modeling that had been done at MIT, how you could most cost effectively do that. And that meant all countries contributing, and that there's enough diversity of who has developed sensors that that's a viable idea. We showed them what such a constellation could look like and who could be contributing. Because if we just stay US centric about this unintentionally, it is a global issue. And if the pandemic hasn't taught us anything, the response needs to be global, the contribution, and it's the length of data that you really want to draw conclusions from space.
Right.
50 years. And that's what distinguishes from weather. Weather is short term. Climate, we used to think it was important to know 10, 20, 30 years. Well, unfortunately, the changes that are occurring in the climate are now much shorter than that. So where you might thought you could build something for 50 years, if you're not adapting to climate change, you're building something that for a climate that's not going to be there.
Sanjay?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say maybe we can think about, space tech as not a new market. I mean, the launch capability is new, but the data coming from space is tapping into existing multi-billion-dollar markets. Weather data and forecasts are a multi-billion-dollar existing market, and business intelligence analytics is a multi-billion-dollar existing market, and it serves all these industries. We talked about agriculture, aviation and shipping, finance and insurance, infrastructure, utilities, all purchase data and analytics that ultimately come from space, from satellites. And what we're seeing is they're increasingly needing that analytics and new types of data and analytics because of the pressures of climate change. So they're already buying data to manage their businesses today, and they're buying more data and analytics and new kinds of it that come from satellites because of climate change and other pressures that they're trying to manage, like their supply chains. And I think that's the opportunity.
And
Yeah.
I just like to add too, excuse me, Lou,
Sure.
that academia, universities are critically important in the analytics. Their PhDs, the PhDs this year, the past 10 years, are some of what we used when we went to these conferences. That's the breeding ground. And that's the millennial generation, that really has to take this fight on.
Yeah, Doug, let me just ask you a follow-up question if I could. Sorry, Lou. I just want to ask you a
No, go ahead.
question about the role that you see of cooperation between ESA, NASA, NOAA, other world government organizations coming together to share data, create a whole picture of the Earth, of climate change, and to potentially plan, international efforts on this problem. What have you seen in that regard? Doug.
Oh, well, that's exactly what the GCOS conference was about.
Right.
I mean, all those people were in the room. Again, I was personally delighted to be the only aerospace representative there, but it was only based on other conferences and having met them. GCOS is taking on the responsibility to develop a massive database with these 260 plus essential climate variables and the accuracy with which it needs to be collected, and creating this huge database, which is free for all to access. They're coming up on an implementation plan of the description of this database in the next year or so. And they're going through a very vigorous review of those variables and getting, professors from around the world to contribute to that review.
Again, you can see the challenge with the collaboration forming, right? I mean, it's any type of collaboration is a challenge. And I want to get back to that, Joe, because I think that's where you're headed here. But I want to ask Paul, when we're on this topic, are you a solo act, Paul, or are you finding that you need to collaborate with the academic sector and with others to move your technology forward? And I think you're on mute, Paul.
Yeah, we do a lot with different organizations. I mean, we're small, so there's only so much we can do. So we are working with some of the major primes. We're working with various universities around. A lot of it is focused on validating the technology that we need. We also do a lot of modeling, so we understand the sophistication needed to model the climate.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I mean, we actually do rocket simulations, which is essentially analyzing a fire in a can. And it's taken, most of the US computing power to actually do those simulations. I mean, it's really, really hard to do. And now we try to look at on the global scale, trying to do computation simulations of what's really going on. So fundamentally, we have to make assumptions and you simplified models, and that's where the database is going to be fabulous, because that gives the truth to that the scientists can go and say, okay, I got to make sure my model fits this data. If it doesn't, there's something wrong, because the data is real. That's what we have to work from.
Right.
And then we use the scientific method. We can't get tied into, oh, this model is gospel and we must follow this. It's, you test it. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, fix it. And you go over and over again, and you get this competition going on between different academics, different companies working back and forth, and we progress and develop the capability to understand what's going on. And we'll know we're there when we can rely upon the long-term weather forecast to plan a trip to Hawaii and know that there's not going to be a hurricane or anything there when we show up. That's the level of fidelity we got to get to get politics out of all this and deal with it. So
yeah, that's a whole other issue. But again, science allows us to, as we say, it's why we love football. It allows us to call the audibles, right, when we have to.
Yep.
One follow-up question to that, Lou, real quick.
Please. Yeah.
On that point, Paul, and this is for Paul and Doug, there are a number of programs out there like Methane Sat, measuring methane emissions, Planet IQ, which is really delivering some breakthrough data, radio occultation data, the best that's ever been put out there. And they've had a successful demo satellite, and they're coming on. But programs like Kuiper, Starlink, Hawkeye 360, we see efforts in the area of commercial climate. What are the major opportunities that you see out there? If we've got a number of budding space entrepreneurs on the call wondering, hey, where are the gaps in what is being done right now in commercial space to address the climate challenge beyond the great work Planet's doing, Planet IQ is doing rather, and Planet and Methane Sat? Where do you guys see the opportunities are right now that governments aren't covering, other commercial guys haven't covered, that's probably gap space that entrepreneurs could think about?
That's difficult. If I knew exactly where it was, I would be there.
That's good. I was thinking that.
So,
yes.
It's there are opportunities. One of the big challenges is getting the financing and the funding to go after these new niches. There are so many possibilities, and as satellite costs are coming down, you could start having companies that are specialized niches to build a microsat or two or a small constellation to go and do certain science that no one else is doing. But
Doug,
to give you specifics, that's hard.
Yeah, Doug, how about you? Is there, so we've got a question here from Sujit Samadar, who said, what can we do about protecting the Arctic and Antarctica? They are the climate creators. And I see little interest in protecting these areas. Is that an opportunity, Doug? Should somebody be thinking about some way of protecting them through a commercial initiative?
Yeah, you're muted, Doug, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So would that it could be true that we could protect them, but it's the nature, of where weather comes from. And, when we have a warming planet, weather originates around the equator. Its effects are being felt much worse in the poles. They're melting quicker, their temperature is rising quicker. So it's what we do to try and curtail, just use CO2 as a primary metric. We have been loading up so many tons of CO2. If we were to stop putting CO2 in the climate right now, it would still be hundreds of years before we would come back to a balance. So that's why it's absolutely critical. It's critical, like a pandemic now, that we find ways to stop that. But methane is a unique opportunity in that it's, as a greenhouse gas, it's more absorbing. As a result, it can have a bigger impact, but it doesn't stay in the atmosphere near as long as CO2 does.
It's kind of the low-hanging fruit, isn't it? It is. It's interesting right now, to do a plug for my podcast at SSPI. Right now, if you listen, we're doing a podcast with Dr. Stephen Hamburg, and Doug, he's saying exactly what you're saying. So it's a fascinating interview about methane sat, by the way.
But again, the need to connect to existing data, as Paul was talking about, how do we project in the future, even the new sources can be used to recalibrate older data we have. Landsat is much that way. You know, as a new Landsat goes up with greater accuracy, they can then go back and refine older Landsat data. And again, that gives us more history, you know, watching the projection of what's happening, what have been the influences of climate change.
Right.
And
I'll just add that, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. Something people may not be aware of is, you know, the US was on track to meeting its Paris 2025 emissions reduction commitments and helping to stabilize the climate at, you know, a livable 2 degrees C. And every year from 2010 to 2016, the US decreased total greenhouse gas emissions while growing GDP. And that happened because came out of public-private partnerships, government policies and support for reducing emissions and growing these critical industries of renewables and electric vehicles and batteries. And now, you know, those are just dominated, they're flourishing from the private sector. And the point is, we can do that again. We're running out of time, but it absolutely can be done to stabilize emissions and stabilize temperatures.
Hey, Sanjay, you know, you raised a good point, and you know, of course, you served in the Obama administration as well as one of your many stellar credentials. What role should government be playing at the federal levels, but also at the state and local levels? You know, I deal with a lot of cities, Winnipeg, places you never heard of. They're doing some terrific work on climate. What should we be thinking about in terms of policy to help the entrepreneurs and the people like Doug who are passionate about this?
Yeah, so we'll get back to space in a second, but just on climate, the government's role is setting the rules. So there were, and hopefully will be again, methane and ozone regs that say how much can be emitted. And then the private sector figures out how to do that the most efficiently. Without those rules, people aren't going to cut emissions. We can put up methane sniffing satellites and they'll just sniff a lot of methane. And so setting the rules, but then also the critical role the government plays is early funding programs as a customer of launch capability or data, and R&D spending, and incentives, subsidies and tax credits. In the early stages of an industry, helping it grow. I'll just point back to the early days of solar, point to NASA in the late 50s and 60s for satellites. And NASA invested in a lot of capability, and ultimately that capability grew in the private sector, starting at Spectralab and then a whole industry. And so similarly here, I would think for space tech, there's a lot that we can do in public-private partnerships that mirrors what's been done for private launch capability around government as an early customer of new types of sensors and data, and providing incentives and coordination as this private industry takes off.
Right. So government is an early mover. Just should government be picking winners and losers in the LEO fleets because they're critical? Or another way to ask that question of you as an investor is, will the players that are continuously launching constellations, will they find their lives as profitable as the people providing, you know, other services and data going forward? How are you guys looking at the new railroad that's being put up there?
Like I said, we tend to focus on commercial customers of the data and analytics coming from these satellites. And we see a real business case, use case, and spending. There's real customers out there for this data. And some companies are differentiating themselves. And I'll just point to a couple examples we haven't invested in, but you know, there's a lot more low Earth orbit satellites with RO sensors, and RO offers, you know, weather data is limited by ground stations, and 90% of all ground weather stations are in US, North America, and Europe. And all of the oceans aren't covered. and the whole rest of the world isn't really covered. And so that is a real limitation to global companies that need accurate weather forecasts. And so with low Earth orbit satellites with RO data or RO sensors or radar sensors, two companies, Spire Global and Tomorrow IO, they're seeing that they can offer more accurate weather forecasts, better weather data, and more importantly, full global coverage for their aviation, maritime, ag, and industrial customers. That's a real market that doesn't depend on the government.
And let me just add, to me, the governments are the non-for-profit contributors here, and they're critically important. Once the or the climate change is understood as a crisis, they need to be willing to make the investments in all the extraordinary ideas that are starting to come to the fore. We got to the moon after we set an objective of that, and we got there in 10 years. Sorry, I got to kill this. And
trying to sell you something, Doug.
I'm convinced that, we got to the moon in 10 years once we set the objective. I believe the same thing is achievable in climate change. There are many, many ideas that need to get research invested dollars, including the government. There are many, many ways.
Right.
And we read about them day by day.
Yeah. Just, Joe and I are going to wrap it up, but Paul, I want to give you the last word on this. Government also, in an instance like this, with an issue like this, would also, it seems to me, it's a personal observation, what should also be the moral force, the ethical force. Here, we talked about ethics last month in our roundtable. Do you share that view that government should sort of be investing in ethical and moral areas, or at least presiding over them as certain administrations do and others tend to do it less?
As a small company, I don't deal in the politics too much, but trying to make pick winners and losers is dangerous because there are thousands of small businesses out there working on breakthrough technologies that could change everything. And there's just a tendency of, let's just discount them. They're not important, and so they wither on the vine. So many breakthroughs have died before they get started and then they go away. And it gets 20, 30 years before it finally happens. So I personally think government, as other people have mentioned, that investment in that early stage R&D, because there's a lot of times that initial payoff is not really obvious. It's hard to convince an investor to bet on something that's never been done before. We've had people say, how's that possible? You can't do that. I've actually had quotes from government customers say, that's not possible. The books say you can't do that, but you did it. How? And it's because we got these little bits of seed money from the government through the SBIR, STTR program, the small business programs, and they gave us the chance to go and develop it. So it's not really a morality issue, it's technology. So much has happened over the last 100 years that technology has just advanced so fast, and because of that, it's pulled up society and the environment. There's been some downturns and stuff too, but in general, we're getting better and better. You look around the world, places with high technology are doing better at addressing climate than those with low technology. And so investing in those technologies and it even just standard companies that are doing just building widgets, they're always investing in technologies, maybe in little ways, trying to improve efficiency and productivity. Every time they improve efficiency a little bit, that reduces the burden on the climate and the infrastructure, and that helps. So there's a little bit of a moral benefit of just making technology better, making satellites better, and just slowly but surely we will develop the technology to change the world and protect it in a way that we can all thrive and and be prosperous.
Make a better satellite world, as we say. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a great answer. And thanks to guys like you, we make those incremental advances. So, Joe, I think that's a pretty good answer that Paul gave us to close out the discussion here. Still want to know how values work their way into this, but that's a whole other roundtable for us. This one though, this was great. What did you learn? What was the key takeaway?
I think we addressed the essential question of what does it take to develop a collective will to address a problem that's big enough to impact all of us, but also difficult for any one single company to address. So it's not an easy question, but I think we wrestled with it a bit. I think Doug brought up some very good points of some international efforts that are going on right now. I think that Sanjay did highlight some of the opportunities for the role that government plays. I think we all see this as being a partnership opportunity. It's not the government's responsibility. We, the people, as an alliance, can step forward and try to address the gap that exists. And I think we're in a super exciting time right now where companies like Paul's, are ready to stand up and do really, really cool things that others think can't be done. And the combination of the right kind of seed funding going to those kinds of companies, we, the people, coming together and developing the collective will to address this problem, the willingness to look at the right kinds of international partnerships that don't threaten any individual national sovereignty, but provide the opportunity for nations to come together and address this problem. I think in an hour, we've not solved the problem, but hopefully we've built some connective tissue among us, and we've challenged our thought, and we've looked at some of the elements that have to come together. This is the purpose of these roundtables, is to ask these hard questions and bring great experts forward like we did today. And I'm very glad everyone's joined us. Next month, we're going to be talking about the state of the SPAC industry and looking at another financial instrument that is an important part, that is playing an important part in making this happen. And we want to look at the financial health of that industry and ask ourselves some hard questions about, is that the long-term way we want to go about to continue this evolution of commercial space? Part of what we do in this roundtable is New York style. We ask very hard questions. So we're going to be looking at some very hard data, and we'll have some great experts on the line to really tackle this. So if you're fragile about SPACs, don't come next month. But if you want to get down to some real hardcore analysis, it's going to be a great hour.
No fragile SPACers
no fragile
allowed. We're going to put a slide up actually showing that and the dates and everything. But while we still got a couple of minutes left, I want to there's some questions for our guests, Joe. One is there still a technology transfer from government to private sector? Sanjay and Doug, do you guys want to pick up on that? Or Paul, if you know that. Sanjay, why don't we start with you?
Sorry,
what's the question? Does. Well, Charles Sharp is asking, is there still technology transfer from government to the private sector? And I know NASA has a tech transfer program. Is there anything else going on that we can help Charles with? Because I may be looking for something like that.
Yeah, in space, I'm not sure. Certainly in climate tech, there's a lot of government R&D that either co-funds or is transferred or licensed to the private sector, but I'm not sure about the space side.
You're absolutely right in Lou space. In fact, one of our collaborators, Steve Gonzalez, was in charge of tech transfer at NASA. So they have a very robust tech transfer program. Most government organizations that don't have security issues associated with them are actually really robustly looking for entrepreneurs to come in and take their technology and develop it. So whoever asked that question, if you'd like some contacts, please reach out to me and I'd be glad to help connect you.
And just to add to that, there are national labs that are graded based on that. They're supposed to do some early research, but they're not supposed to be the one that builds a satellite or takes a technology to space. They're supposed to pass it off. And I was involved in that with Lawrence Livermore here. So it's a requirement for them to get successive funding that they are passing technology off.
That's interesting. Paul, was there any technology transfer coming your way when you begin, GTL?
Not directly. A lot of it was NASA and DoD agencies telling us what they needed, and we would do the R&D. There is tech, there is tech transfer available. We have looked at it a few times. Challenge is having the resources to actually do something with the technology once you got it. It takes a process to go through, get the agreements with NASA or whatever agency to get it, and then you got to use it. And so you gotta make things happen, and that's where the need for investment comes in to provide the legs for us to implement that tech and put it into systems.
Exactly, get it going. Okay, we've got another question about exploring international consortiums to promote the importance of oceans on climate change, and can we support it at the government level? There are several that I know of, Doug. Do any come to mind that are of good value if someone wants to get involved with those?
Oh yeah, do people realize that we have, oh my gosh, do I remember the number? I think there are 2,300 things that look like a torpedo that are in the oceans around the globe. They drop down to, I think, 1,500 feet, take measurements, then pop back up, and then they broadcast to satellites the temperature information. It's the Argon system. Boy, this is, I need to reload tapes, but it's fascinating, what information is being collected, where they all are, and it's critically important. We actually would wish that they gave us even more depth information now. But that's available to all. I mean, almost everything NASA does. OCO, the replacement for the CO2 satellite that was lost. I mean, after a year or half a year of calibration, that data is available publicly. So that's a charter for many of the government-funded programs.
Very good. We're out of time now, so geez, Joe, I think we should really thank these guys profusely for their contribution today.
No, absolutely. We're really appreciative of the expertise that was brought to the table. And I just want to encourage everyone on the call that if you'd like to take advantage of Doug's offer to do this 40-minute climate reality presentation, please reach out to him. You can find him on LinkedIn. And if Doug, if you want to leave your information in the chat, please do so. But we encourage everyone to take advantage of his generous offer.
Yeah, Sanjay, Paul, Doug, thanks so much for this amazing conversation. We really appreciate it. We appreciate you coming to the roundtable and not being afraid of a New York style conversation. So you guys are used to it. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks for organizing.
Well, it's our great pleasure. And for those of you who remember Rice Krispies, you'll recognize what we're going to be doing next month. Joe, you want to talk about it a little bit?
Well, I think I mentioned it before, but we want to take a hard look at the special purpose acquisition companies and the really interesting role they've been playing in spurring the new space economy. And we'd like to keep this positive momentum rolling. We want to take a hard look at the fundamentals and, see what we see. And if there are areas where, folks can be informed on how to continue to make this market strong and robust and sustainable, and ultimately, a great return on investment for participants, we want to take a hard look at that.
Exactly. And so that those will be on the third Wednesdays of the month, as we always are at the roundtable here. Tamara, my date screen went blank, but the SSPI WISE group is meeting next Thursday, I believe, for the Women in Art group.
That is correct. It is next Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern. It is for the women of the industry. All women of the industry are invited, and we hope to see you there. The information is on the SSPI website. You can look under member network for SSPI-WISE.
And for more information on SSPI events, go to sspi.org/events. You'll find everything there. Next week on the 24th, you'll meet Sanjay again you'll see Sanjay again. He's in a podcast that we did on this subject, which I think again you'll find equally fascinating. And if you go there now, as I mentioned, we speak with Dr. Stephen Hamburg for Methane Sat, and that's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and SSPI.org. Joe, thanks again for being my partner on this. I think we're off to a good start this year.
Can I ask a quick question? From the audience that was listening to us, will we receive, or can they ask questions?
They have been.
Okay.
Yep. And if they have others, they can certainly send them to us.
I would love to hear their feedback if they're willing.
Absolutely.
From what I hear, they all thought it was an awesome session.
No, come on,
honestly,
New York style.
exactly.
What are their hard questions?
Well, listen, everybody, we thank you for showing up. We'll see you next month. And as we always say, let's make it a better satellite world. And as we say in New York, or else. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.